Imagine this. You are the Queen of England, but your entire life depends on one thing: giving the king a son. And if you fail, you disappear. This was the world of Jane Seymour, the woman who gave the king everything he wanted and paid for it with her life. But to understand her story, you need to understand him. Henry VIII, I was obsessed with one thing: a male heir, not just a son, but survival. His father, Henry VII, had taken the throne after the brutal Wars of the Roses. The Tudor dynasty was new, fragile. Without a son, it could all collapse. So Henry married Catherine of Aragon, a powerful alliance, a hopeful beginning. But then, tragedy after tragedy, pregnancies lost, children buried. Their only surviving child, Mary, First of England, was not enough, because she wasn't a boy. And that's when everything started to break. Henry fell in love with another woman, Anne Boleyn. He divorced Catherine, defied the church, changed the course of England forever, all for one goal: a son. But even after all that, still no male heir, only another daughter, Elizabeth I. And now, Henry was running out of time, and that's when everything shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically at first, but quietly, almost unnoticed. Somewhere in the background of the court, there was a woman who couldn't have been more different from Anne. Jane Seymour was calm where Anne was fiery, gentle where Anne was bold, obedient where Anne resisted. She had once served Catherine of Aragon and had seen the pain of a queen cast aside. She knew exactly what this world did to women, and she learned from it. Henry noticed, and once he did, he couldn't unsee her. By the mid-1530s, his marriage to Anne Boleyn was already cracking under pressure. The arguments became constant, the tension unbearable. Anne knew what was happening. She had once replaced a queen, and now she was being replaced. When she discovered Henry with Jane, the realization hit instantly. This wasn't just another court flirtation. This was the beginning of the end. In early 1536, everything collapsed at once. Anne lost the child she believed would save her, a miscarriage, and with it, her last chance. For Henry, that was enough. Within months, accusations appeared: adultery, treason, even incest. Whether they were true or not didn't matter. The outcome had already been decided. Anne Boleyn was executed on May 19, 1536, and less than 2 weeks later, Henry married Jane. No mourning, no pause, just a new queen. To the court, it was shocking. Jane wasn't the most beautiful, not the most educated, not the most powerful, but that was exactly the point. After years of chaos, Henry didn't want passion anymore. He wanted control, and Jane gave him that. But beneath that quiet image, there may have been more. Some historians believe Jane understood the game perfectly, that her softness wasn't weakness, but strategy, because she did something no one else had managed to do. She brought peace, at least for a moment. She showed kindness to Henry's daughters, especially Mary, First of England, who had been cast aside for years. She even convinced Henry to reconcile with her, something Anne had never been able to achieve. For the first time in years, the court felt stable. But one thing still remained unresolved, the one thing that had destroyed every woman before her: the heir. And in early 1537, Jane became pregnant. This was it, the moment everything had been leading to. Months passed slowly, carefully. Every sign, every movement mattered. This wasn't just a pregnancy. This was the future of England. And when the time finally came, It was nothing like the fairy tale people imagined. The labor lasted nearly 50 hours. Pain, exhaustion, uncertainty. But in the end, she did it. She gave Henry what no one else could, a son. Edward VI was born on October 12, 1537. Across England, there was relief, celebration. The dynasty was safe. Henry finally had his heir. The one thing he had spent his entire life chasing. But the story doesn't end there. Because 9 days later, everything changed again. 9 days later, the Queen who had finally secured the future of England was dying. What they called childbed fever, what we now understand as a postpartum infection, spread quickly through Jane Seymour's body. There was nothing anyone could do. On October 24, 1537, she was gone. And just like that, the only woman who gave Henry VIII exactly what he wanted, paid the ultimate price. For Henry, this loss was different. This wasn't anger. This wasn't betrayal. This was grief. Real grief. He locked himself away, dressed in black for months, and for the first time. It seemed like he understood the cost of his obsession. But even in grief, one thing remained. The boy. Edward VI, the center of everything. Henry became extremely protective. The prince's rooms were cleaned obsessively. Everything he touched was washed, every detail controlled. This wasn't just care, it was fear. Fear of losing the only son he would ever have. As Edward grew, it became clear he was different, intelligent, focused, almost too aware for his age. He was educated intensely, studying languages, philosophy, mathematics, and according to his tutors, he loved it. But there was something else shaping him, something deeper. Religion. Edward didn't just believe, he was devoted. As England's first Protestant king, his faith would define everything he did. Guided closely by Thomas Cranmer, he began to see his role not just as a ruler, but as someone chosen to transform England itself. Traditions were removed, Catholic practices banned. The country was changing, and Edward was at the center of it. But power never exists in isolation, especially not for a child. When Henry VIII died in 1547, Edward was only 9 years old, a king, surrounded by men who wanted control. Officially, a council was meant to rule together. In reality, it didn't take long for ambition to take over. His own uncle, Edward Seymour, quickly rose to power, becoming the dominant figure in England. Decisions were made around the king, sometimes without him, and for a while, Edward trusted him. But power shifts. It always does. Within just a few years, Seymour fell, arrested, replaced, and Edward was moved like a piece on a board. At one point forced to hide inside Windsor, writing that he felt like a prisoner, a king who wasn't free. Eventually, control passed to John Dudley. Unlike before, Edward was allowed more involvement, more voice. And this is where we begin to see who he really was becoming. Not just a boy king, but someone determined, strong-willed, especially when it came to religion. But even as he grew into that power, something else was already happening. Quietly, slowly. His body was failing him. In 1552, Edward became seriously ill. He recovered, but never fully. By the following year, it was clear. This wasn't temporary. This was the end. And Edward knew it. And as his power began to grow, so did something else. Something far darker. Edward VI is often remembered as a young, intelligent, deeply religious king. But that devotion came with a cost. Because Edward didn't just support Protestantism, He enforced it, relentlessly. Under his rule, England moved aggressively away from Catholic traditions. Old rituals were banned, churches were stripped, and those who resisted were no longer seen as opponents, but as threats. This wasn't passive reform. This was control, and it turned violent. Rebellions broke out across the country, most notably the Prayer Book Rebellion in 1549, when thousands rose against the enforced religious changes. The response was brutal. The uprising was crushed, and several thousand people were killed in the aftermath. Not soldiers on a battlefield, but ordinary people. And even beyond rebellion, persecution became part of the system. Catholic leaders were arrested, removed, or silenced. The message was clear. There was no space for opposition. What makes this even more unsettling is his age. Edward was still a child, but he wasn't unaware. He was present in council meetings, engaged in decisions, and deeply committed to his beliefs. This wasn't just a kingdom acting around him. This was a king who believed he was right, who believed he was saving England, and that conviction made him dangerous. Because when someone is absolutely certain they are doing God's work, there are very few limits to what they are willing to justify. And this is only the beginning. If you enjoy thoughtful history, stay with this channel and subscribe. But the deeper Edward went into his beliefs, the more personal everything became. Because this was no longer just about religion. It was about family. His older sister, Mary, stood for everything he was trying to erase. She remained firmly Catholic, refusing to abandon the faith she had been raised in by their mother, Catherine of Aragon. For Mary, this wasn't politics. It was identity, and Edward knew it. At first, there was still a connection between them. Letters, moments of warmth, even affection. He had once called her his favorite, but as he grew older, that bond began to fracture. Not suddenly, but slowly under the weight of belief and power. Edward began pressuring Mary to conform, to abandon her practices, to attend Protestant services. And when she refused, it became a problem the crown could no longer ignore. There were real discussions at court about punishing her, even removing her from the line of succession. Because to Edward, this wasn't just disobedience. It was a threat to everything he believed England should become. And then there was his other sister, Elizabeth. Elizabeth was different, careful, observant, strategic. Where Mary resisted, Elizabeth adapted. She outwardly conformed, avoided open conflict, and understood how dangerous this environment truly was. Edward trusted her more. But even that trust had limits, because in a court shaped by fear, religion, and ambition, no one was ever completely safe, not even family. By the early 1550s, the reality was clear. These were no longer just siblings. They were rivals, symbols of two different futures for England. And as Edward's health began to fail, that conflict would decide everything that came next. And once he understood that he was dying, everything became urgent. Edward was still only a teenager. But now he was thinking like a ruler facing the end of his reign. His greatest fear wasn't death itself, it was what would happen after. Because by law, the throne would pass to Mary. And Mary was Catholic, deeply Catholic. Everything Edward had built, every reform, every change to the Church of England, could be undone the moment she took power. And that was something he could not accept. So even as his body weakened, his mind remained sharp. He began drafting a plan, a new line of succession. one that would bypass both of his sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, declaring them illegitimate once again. Instead, he chose his Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey, a decision that would change everything and ultimately fail. By the summer of 1553, Edward could no longer stand. His breathing grew heavy, his body exhausted, his voice barely above a whisper. But he continued signing documents, pushing his plan forward, determined to control the future even as he was losing control of his own life. "I am glad to die," he reportedly said, not because he wanted to, but because he believed he had done what he could. On July 6, 1553, Edward VI died. He was just 15 years old, and almost immediately, his plan began to unravel. Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed queen, but the support around her was fragile. Within days, the country turned. People rallied behind Mary, the rightful heir in their eyes. Just 9 days later, it was over. Mary took the throne. Mary became the first crowned Queen of England, ruling in her own right. And just like that, everything Edward had tried to prevent happened anyway. His reforms were reversed. England returned to Catholic rule, and the boy who had tried to shape the future was gone before he could truly control it. But the story does not end with him, because in the end, the greatest irony belongs to the man who started it all. Henry VIII spent his entire life chasing a son, breaking marriages, executing wives, reshaping a kingdom, all for a male heir. And yet, it would not be his son who defined England's future. It would be the daughter he once overlooked. Elizabeth would rise to the throne after Mary and rule for 45 years, one of the greatest monarchs in English history. The woman Henry never truly valued became the one England would never forget. And in that, there is a question history leaves behind. What if Henry had never been obsessed with a son? What if Jane had lived? What if Edward had ruled longer? Because in the end, the Tudor dynasty did not fall because it lacked power. It fell because of the choices made in fear, control, and obsession. And when the noise of politics finally fades, what remains isn't just power or crowns or victories. What remains are people, lives that were shaped and broken by decisions they didn't always control. Jane Seymour never ruled for long, never built policies, never led armies, and yet her impact changed everything. She was remembered not for ambition, but for something far more fragile in that world: calm, restraint, and a quiet kind of influence. She reunited a broken family, even if only for a moment. She gave a king peace, even if it didn't last. And she gave England its long-awaited heir, knowing, perhaps, what it could cost her. There's something almost tragic in how little of her voice survives. No grand speeches, no personal writings that reveal her thoughts in detail. Just fragments, observations from others, a life reconstructed through silence. And yet, through that silence, a picture still forms. Not of weakness, but of someone who understood exactly where she stood and played her role with precision. As for Edward VI, he never truly had the chance to become what he might have been. Raised as the answer to a kingdom's greatest fear, he carried expectations from the moment he was born. His life was never his own, guided, influenced, sometimes controlled. And yet, even within that, glimpses of his own will appeared. His devotion, his intellect, his determination to shape England's future. All of it was real. But it was cut short before it could fully unfold. And maybe that's the quiet tragedy at the center of it all. a king who waited his entire life for a son, a woman who gave everything to deliver him, and a boy who inherited a kingdom he was never given enough time to rule. In the end, the Tudor story isn't just about power. It's about pressure, expectation, survival, and the cost of chasing something so intensely that everything else begins to break around it. And maybe that's why we still try to imagine them, not just as names in history, but as real people. To see Jane Seymour not just as the one who gave him a son, but as a woman who never got to see the world she changed. And Edward VI, not just as a king, but as a boy who was never given the time to become one. Thank you for watching. If you value history told carefully and accurately, consider staying with this channel and subscribing. The past deserves precision as much as curiosity.